Good morning. Welcome to day 2. It seems like everybody's fired up. I get that sense. I remain Andrew Seligsohn, president of Campus Compact. And I need to start with just a couple of quick program notes. One is that most of what actually happens at Campus Compact, certainly at this conference and more generally, is due to the work of my colleague Maggie Grove, who is our vice president for strategy and operations. Yes. And if I were to cause a room full of 500 people to sing in relation to Maggie, I would not be able to go back to work again, so I'm not going to do that. But if you see Maggie today, you can wish her a happy birthday. So that's where I'll leave it. I also wanted to note that in the house today, and there may be more, but I know we have at least 2 of our fabulous Newman Civic Fellows from the 2017 class, one of whom you saw on the big screen yesterday. She missed her big screen debut, Alexis Lenderman. We also have Eric Jenkins, who has been out at I just saw him at the table of our wonderful partner organization, the Ronald Reagan Foundation and Institute. If you see Alexis, you'll recognize her from the screen. If you see Eric out at the table, say hello to them, talk to them about their experience, and I'm just really glad they're here with us today. So yeah, that's good. You can applaud for them. They are fantastic. I am, first of all, acknowledging that I'm just right now standing in front of a group of people who will be introduced in a moment, so I'm not ignoring them. I haven't forgotten. They're behind me. You'll learn who they are in just a few moments. So, and I think I just see our Newman Civic Fellows sitting right down at the table here. So there they are. It's very hard. We're blinded by lights up here. So I just wanted to say a couple words about the panel we're about to move into and why we thought this was a conversation worth having today. And for me, it connects directly to the theme of our meeting, True Stories of Engagement. One of the reasons that theme resonates with me personally is that I have found myself telling my own story in the last couple of years in a way that I never had before. So I come from a family, I'm the child of a refugee, a genocide refugee, whose father was lost to us in the Nazi genocide. So that was my grandfather. And that was something I didn't talk a ton about most of my life, partly because as a person who grew up in great privilege myself, I never wanted to seem like I was positioning myself in a way that wasn't real. But in the last few years, as refugees and immigrants have come under assault, it seemed much more important to share that history and to recontextualize who immigrants and refugees are for people in our country. And so I found myself thinking about my story not as something that falsely claimed a position I did not have, but that built solidarity with people who might not have the same opportunity for voice that I have. So thinking about my own story has also led me to think about the complexity of that story and of my family. So I just wanted to say a few things that are true about my family. We are European Americans, we are African Americans, we are Asian Americans. We are straight, we are gay, we are cisgendered, we are trans, we are liberal, we are conservative, we are people who chant Black Lives Matter, and we are people who put on a uniform with a badge and a gun every day. And that's my family. And I don't think that's different from many of your families. Even though we are increasingly segregated in various ways in the United States, it's also true that we have many more mixed-race families than we used to in the United States. So we are crossing lines even as we are drawing lines, and it causes for many of us deep personal tension. Tension that is not just political and public and external to ourselves, but is also part of who we are and the lives we live every day. For that reason, I think I have felt particularly personally whipsawed by the experience of the last few years. It seemed after Ferguson, after Baltimore, that we were beginning to have a conversation about race in the United States that we had not had, at least during my lifetime. And we saw that on campuses with students coming forward and articulating what the meaning of the histories of their institutions were to them and how they needed those to be acknowledged and changed for them to live in a full way as students on their campuses. And then we had the 2016 campaign, and all of a sudden the focus shifted, and another group of Americans who have in fact been excluded from opportunity for a long time, people in communities that have been abandoned by the American economy across the Midwest and across the country, were suddenly the focus of all our attention, and somehow that meant that we could not also recognize these other histories that we had been talking about just briefly. And that doesn't make any sense to me personally. It doesn't fit with my experience of the world, and I think that's probably true for many of us. And one of the things that I think many of us have been led to feel in the face of that is that we have to start talking to each other differently. We have to create conditions under which people whose experiences and beliefs about the world are radically different from each other can somehow find ways to discover common ground. And again, for me, this relates back to what I started with yesterday, that we cannot wait around for our public officials, our political leaders, our formal media institutions to do this for us. This has to start with us, it has to be done by us, and the pressure has to be pushed upward, not downward. So we thought it would be valuable for people at this meeting to have an introduction to some of what we see as really promising approaches for engaging across various kinds of differences in difficult dialogues to seek to move conversations forward, build stronger connections, recognizing differences, but creating the opportunity for shared work and building shared communities that are more equitable, more inclusive, and more just. And so that's the conversation we're going to have this morning. I'm about to turn the floor over to my colleague, Leslie Garvin, who is the Executive Director of North Carolina Campus Compact. Leslie will introduce the panel, and I will have you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning. Oh, good, I needed that. I'm not a morning person, and that was all I could give. So thank you, Andrew, for sharing your story and your honesty. In North Carolina, you may have heard about us in the news over the last couple of years. We're a place that has deep divides and great opportunities. So for the last 5 years, we have tried to create space to introduce our campuses to different dialogue models like deliberative dialogue, deliberative pedagogy, sustained dialogue. And so I've had the pleasure of working with a few of our panelists, and I am really excited about the conversation that we're going to have this morning. How many of you, by a show of hands, read the nonprofit AF, formerly Nonprofit with Balls blog, Ule? Yeah, so you probably know about his blog post, 12 Ways Not to Suck as a Panel Moderator. So I read it last night, and I'm going to break a few of the rules, so sorry, Vu. But I will say that Vu does recommend that if you all go over time, that I should glare at you and do my hand like this. So if you see that happening, you know what's happening. But truly, I will encourage our panelists to share, but to also honor our time. And our hope is that this really is a conversation that we have amongst ourselves. These are experts in the field of dialogue. I do want to let you know up front, we are not planning to have questions from the audience, but our panelists have agreed that they will be available throughout the rest of the conference. If you want to talk to them, you can obviously find them on their websites as well. But these are folks, and we want to hear from them about the how and the why of dialogue. So we're going to begin with breaking Vu's rule, and we're going to go down the line, and I'm going to ask you to each give a little bit about who you are and about your organization, the mission, the history, where you're located, what's your scale of work. And we'll come back talking about the actual dialogue work you do. So we're going to start with Bill Doherty, who is from the University of Minnesota and Better Angels.
And 2 minutes before I get this, okay. So yes, from Minnesota, I came here for the weather. Happy to be in tropical Indianapolis. So I'm a co-founder of a group called Better Angels, which is the newest group, I'm sure, in the room. We got started, about a year before the election with a mission to depolarize America. And we've been, you can see, America is better than ever after we got started. And then after the election, so we started around gay marriage, religious liberty. And we brought together some folks to talk about that and to see if they could find common ground. And then after the election, we pivoted to the red-blue divide. And so Better Angels is laser focused on doing community workshops, and we've done them on college campuses, where we bring reds and blues together for workshops of either 3 hours or 6 hours, to come to understand each other beyond stereotypes and see if they can find common ground. And out of some of those workshops come red-blue alliances where people continue to meet together to understand, to continue to understand each other better and to see if they can find some common policies to work on. We also have a 2.5-hour skills workshop for all comers. It can be 5 to 50 people, and it doesn't have to be equal reds and blues. Skills workshops, skills of how to communicate with people you know who differ with you politically. So we have had workshops in 23 states since the elections. We have trained what we call workshop moderators. And my connection to Campus Compact is in Minnesota. I just trained 18 people from various campuses around the state to learn how to do these red-blue workshops, which are tightly organized, aiming not for declaring and debating, but for listening and understanding. And so far, evaluations of these have shown that they seem to be useful. So I'm happy to be here to talk more about Better Angels. All you have to do is Google Better Angels, and you can find us. And I didn't get this, right?
No.
Okay.
Good job.
That was my goal. That was my goal.
Thanks, Bill.
Hi, I'm Rhonda. It's nice to be here. I'm happy to share the work, and I'll be presenting at 1:30, I believe, so I won't be sharing the full model. But what you need to know about the work of the Sustained Dialogue Institute, it has a long history over 4 decades that has brought it into hundreds of places, especially campuses, but also used in state negotiations. So its genesis is in international relations. Our founder was a man named Dr. Harold Saunders. Many of you knew him. Many of you might have studied him. His work developed as a result of his learnings after doing the Camp David Shuttle Accords, figuring out the most difficult parts of negotiations were getting people to the table. And he began to record his writings and his learnings from what happens when a relationship is built from people who hate each other. That work began to be adapted to campus by none other than industrious students, sort of like the ones you're working with on your campus. They, in 1999, so almost 20 years ago, realized that they were having some major community, residential college, but entrenched issues around race and ethnicity. We can't understand why other people aren't experiencing the campus. We are around race. We can't understand how things got so, how did things get this way? And they began to adapt Hal Saunders' 5-stage process. And they said they had no idea what they were doing. They weren't race experts. They were regular people like people who hadn't studied this and said, we just need to dive in to figure out how to care about each other and understand the other's experience. So sustained dialogue is really nothing more than an intentional process that people enter into with a commitment to say, I see something that's a norm I don't want to learn from, and I want to do something about it in my present community. So we've structured on 65 campuses globally, a capacity building from the ground up. So grassroots students, faculty who want to talk to each other, student life, like at Elon, where the Division of Student Life says we can't do this work to support our students unless we're talking about sexual orientation, religion, age, gender, race, all of the things that affect our students and all the things that they bring into the classroom. And even college presidents have been a part of the conversation, like at Beloit College, where the president has been involved in a sustained dialogue and said it helped him not to be so glib. And it's been carried out in a multitude of contexts, and it's very adaptable. And we do about 50 trainings per year with a staff of 2.5. So that's pretty important. Average amount of people per training is about 45 to 50, and they're learning how to do all the difficult conversations, regardless of the topic. Anything that falls into the level of intergroup community conflict is in the wheelhouse of sustained dialogue. So I can tell you more later.
Great. And that was Rhonda Fitzgerald. And now we have Katie Hyten.
Hi, I work for Essential Partners. And Essential Partners, formerly Public Conversations Project, we've been around for almost 30 years now. And we were actually formed by family therapists, which is a little bit unique for a dialogue institution. And in their families, our founders paid attention to the patterns of how their families communicated when things got tough. So rather than trying to get rid of disagreement altogether, they started paying attention to how people reacted when conflict happened. and then shifted how the conversation happened to ultimately lead not just to a better outcome from that disagreement, but also better relationships. And they really got started with the abortion issue in Boston, which is where we're located. We're based out of Cambridge. And in 1994, the issue of abortion had really hit a peak of divisiveness in our city, and it ended and culminated in a shooting in an abortion clinic. And so our founders brought together 5 pro-life and pro-choice leaders from both sides of the aisle, all of whom were very strong leaders in their communities. And these women had no pretenses that they were going to convince one another of their argument, but what they wanted to do was de-escalate the divisive rhetoric in their community. And they met for 5 years, and they're still really good friends today, and that really provided the foundation for our work. In the following 25 years, we've addressed all of the issues that people generally tell you to avoid in polite conversation, so we jump into all of the conversations that are really tough around issues of identity, race, religion, political ideology, even personality styles and things like that as well. In the past 3 years alone, we've done 200 projects for over 8,000 people in 31 states and 8 countries. But about 50 of those are in higher ed institutions. So we also work in civic engagement work in communities and in faith institutions. Our work is largely capacity building at this point as well, similar to Rhonda, but we also facilitate really tough conversations and then do some consultation and coaching as well. Our biggest piece of work right now are facilitator trainings. We've done 20 of those this year and trained 550 facilitators. But the power of those folks is that over 50% of them will go out and facilitate groups and lead in their communities to higher levels of cohesion, understanding, resilience, and effectiveness in their organizations, teams, and communities. So what's interesting about that is that we've actually been experiencing tremendous growth in the past few years. We've already run as many programs in the first half of our fiscal year this year as we did all year last year. So we're really busy, but what I think that tells us is that people are finally starting to realize the role that identity plays in our everyday lives and the difficult conversations that are coming up in our teams, in our communities, in our schools, in our campuses. And they're really wanting to improve that, but don't necessarily have the tools. And so they're calling on us to basically help them figure out how to have those conversations that are so important. And it's really exciting that people are starting to pay attention to this.
Thanks, Katie. Now we have Nick Longo, Providence College.
Thanks, Leslie. So let me start by saying I'm so excited that Campus Compact is doing this panel and has a whole series of workshops on dialogue and deliberation. And in some ways, it follows my trajectory in this field. I was an undergraduate, without really knowing it, I got into 3 service learning courses, and it changed my life. And it changed my life because I saw I didn't have to choose between wanting to be a student and wanting to change the world. And then as I was a grad student, I worked on this project called Raise Your Voice. Was anyone in this room, how many folks in this room were involved with Raise Your Voice? Oh, we still got some, that's great to see. So Raise Your Voice was a national civic engagement initiative, and we were working with college students around the country on dialogue and asset-based mapping on their campuses. And one of the key takeaways for me from that campaign and working with students is that students learn about democracy and civic engagement not by what we say about it, but by the way it's practiced on campus. So we need to think about more ways to have participatory practices on campus. From there, I worked on a project with NERCI and a lot of other colleagues called Next Generation Engagement. And Next Generation Engagement was thinking about what's the future of this work need to look like. And one of the things that we were finding is that especially early career faculty, graduate students, folks who are coming into the academy, more and more see institutional change as a core part of their work. And a big piece of institutional change has to be about participatory practices, how we make decisions on campus, how we talk to each other. So since 2011, I've been part of a group sponsored and organized by the Kettering Foundation, a group of faculty from around the world. We've got more than 50 faculty involved. And what we started as a group of faculty interested in dialogue in the classroom. And you could tell that only a group of faculty could come up with this term, and I think it's the reason that there is a guide to the perplexed is the subtitle of this. But what we began calling our work is deliberative pedagogy. And for us, deliberative pedagogy was this idea that we need to take the ideas of dialogue and the lessons of dialogue and apply it to our teaching, applying it to the way we practice our work in the classroom, and very much like the lessons of service learning, that we want to see dialogue and deliberation be integrated within the academic curriculum. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Nick. So this group is so good that they already have covered question 2, which was describe your dialogue approach and your way that you do the work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Rhonda and I'm going to ask Katie if you could, because I know your organizations have been around for 15 years or more, so if you could talk a little bit about why is dialogue, why is deliberation valuable, why is it a necessary tool, and think about that maybe in opposition or complementary to other ways of engagement, service learning and these other ways that we promote engagement.
Sure. So for us, dialogue is important because how we communicate impacts every aspect of who we are and how we engage with others, especially across differences. And I appreciated and loved what Nick had to say too about embodying that in every aspect of our lives. So we work certainly in some of the most difficult issues. We work with Black Lives Matter activists and police. We work with gun safety and gun rights activists. We work on some really tough issues, but we're also working in the classroom on helping students and faculty better hold both confidence and knowledge in what they're doing, but also humility and intellectual humility about what they're learning and what they're growing into. And so for us, it's really shifting how people engage in their everyday lives. And we're hearing from students that they are bringing even the quietest students into conversations over the course of a semester. We're hearing that these students are actually feeling like they can go out and be activists and be advocates for what they believe, even if they don't have PhDs yet, because they found their voice in these classes. And when it comes to especially work in higher ed right now, there are so many conversations happening. And one of the reasons we started working with faculty in the classroom is a lot of them were coming up to us and saying, these conversations are coming up whether we want them to or not. You know, we are dealing with these issues in our classes every day, and we don't have the tools to do that. And it's amazing to think that we've kind of lost that fundamental capacity to really wrestle with people who believe very differently than us or whose experiences are very different than us. And not just in formal dialogues, but in our everyday lives and interactions. We talk a lot with folks who in their teams can't function as a team because one person is doing all the work or because one person isn't doing any work. Who, you know, are dealing with different times and schedules of when they can meet, if one person has a family and one person doesn't. And there are all these dynamics that show up every day that really dialogue and these skills can help build capacity for folks to do that in their own communities and contexts.
Thanks, Katie.
That was beautiful, and there's not much else to say. But I can share one question that I tend to ask at the beginning of our workshops is how many of you were raised in a culture of dialogue according to the definition that we use, which is listening deeply enough to be changed by what you learn as a practice, as a way of doing things. And for students, this is a revelation. It's this funny law that I've observed. No matter what the room size, there's 2 people who raise their hand confidently in every room, which is against mathematics and statistics. The size of the room should vary with how many people were raised in a culture of dialogue. But in terms of deliberate practice, a way to approach tough questions as a set of values that supersedes things like hierarchy or supersedes things like rank and title, that allows people to work across lines of difference, especially in higher education, the skills are rarer in dialogue than they should be. The amount of people I see who can masterfully conduct a classroom using debate pedagogy is wonderful. And it's a really beautiful thing that can get somebody to learn their voice. But many, many people need an on-ramp that's easier, where somebody's not going to argue with them about what they're still developing in terms of their belief. And dialogue creates easy on-ramps for participation in things like service learning. So first you've got to figure out, can I speak? Am I somebody with things to say? What do I care about? And get a little self-reflective about what matters to you before you end up into a space where somebody, like the people in the room, are pushing you out into a community to soar. And I think dialogue's a really easy on-ramp for a lot of our students who tend to identify as not the traditional student leader, not overly engaged in everything, but sometimes just looking for a way to connect with community or to understand the stereotypes that they believe others may have about them on their own campuses where they live. And so addressing some of that human dimension of conflicts and the things that people bring in personally is, I think, a really strong place for dialogue that creates that on-ramp to your work.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I'm gonna ask Bill and I'm gonna ask Nick if you can talk a little bit about what are some of the, oh, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna ask Katie.
I'm happy to
Now I'm
do
gonna
that.
ask Bill, if you all could talk a little bit about what are some of the essential elements needed for a successful dialogue.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I'm going to be a little more controversial. Okay, can I just? Because the whole world we're talking about here, what I've learned since working with Better Angels, is a blue world. What I learned is that even the term dialogue to conservatives sounds liberal. And so one of the elements of doing this work that I didn't know before the election is how easily people who do what I do and what some of us do in our regular descriptions of what we're doing can turn off, or if not turn off, at least signal to what we call Reds that it isn't their world, it isn't their religion, if you will. So that's been a principal new learning for me. So in our work, we don't use the word dialogue. We don't use the word deliberation. We talk about workshops. And we talk about finding common ground. And so some of my learning journey has been about the intentional use of terms of descriptions that do not immediately signal one part of the political spectrum that they don't fit here. So the language of so many colleges and universities who are interested in dialogue and deliberation starts with diversity and inclusiveness and social justice. Ba-da, blue, 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 blue. And if you think that's not right, imagine a college university where the signal was American greatness and solidarity, and we are one people, and we love this country. Then the blues go, whoa, not necessarily for me. So I wanted to get that into our conversation early as something that has really struck me around college campuses and communities in the year 2018. So what Better Angels has done from the beginning, and David Blankenhorn, who was one of the key founders, had this vision right away, is that at every level of leadership, we're half Reds and half Blues. And so people can correct each other, if you will. And what we design has to meet the felt needs and the language systems and the meaning systems of both sides. So the board is half red, half blue, the leadership council, the workshops have to be half red and half blue. So I wanted to just throw that in here to get us thinking about, because you know what's going on at college campuses, at least in my part of the world, Minnesota, the conservative students are hiding out, and they are turning to their own form of identity politics. And we sort of have created a new victim class. And unless there are people inviting them, this is our experience, into these conversations who they identify with, who they feel, if you will, safe with, they're not going to come forward. So that's a little thing to throw in here.
That's great. So I hear you saying that one of the key elements is that we have to be just uniquely aware of our audience, of our language, of the jargon, and walk into these spaces with humility.
And yes, thank you. And we're not going to get there unless we have colleagues who are of the other color, if you will. We use the red-blue because otherwise people say I'm a libertarian, I'm not a conservative, and I'm a Bernie instead of a liberal. So we say red-blue. But it has to be in connection and mutual challenge with peers. not people who we are teaching how to do this, because the whole world of deliberation and dialogue has been a liberal world. And so the very terms we use that we think are descriptive, objective, technical terms have a, if you will, coloration. And the only way to work around this is with colleagues and peers who are of a, quote, different color.
So even when we're designing these dialogues, we have to make sure that we have people in the room who are checking us and who are bringing an alternative perspective. So the design is critical as well, and I know, Katie, you have some thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I also want to note that sometimes that skepticism is also on the other side. That student activists may be very skeptical of dialogue because they see it as just talk, right? They see it as something to appease students, that the administration or that the people in power have done something, but not actually done anything. And so it's interesting that the work that we do has to walk a very fine line. That's not just language, but it's also practicing what we preach. And that piece, so there are two things that we hold in this that I think can encapsulate if you're thinking about doing this on your campus. The first is purpose. Purpose is the first thing that guides our work every single time that we do it. It's the purpose that tells us to say no if somebody wants culture change and asks us to do a 1-hour workshop, right? But it's also that if people say that they want culture change on their campus, then we say, okay, what students are you inviting? What faculty are you inviting? What staff are you inviting? And that, you know, in that classroom, that intellectual humility work where we're seeing students start to engage, that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and it takes commitment. And there are some bumps along the road. You know, the quiet students aren't going to speak up in the first day of class just because you give them the space to do so. Similarly, in one of the colleges that we worked with, after they began these conversations, they saw actually a temporary rise in bias incidences reported. And then they realized that more students were reporting bias incidents, first because they knew that they could because of these conversations, and second because they thought something might actually happen, right? So it would have been easy for that administration to say, you know, we've started having these conversations, it's brought some things to the surface that are really tough, and we're just gonna shut it down. But what ended up happening, the longer that they had those conversations, is that bias incidence reporting actually went down first to the level that it began at, and then it started to go down further. And so we know that it takes purpose, and we know that we have to align the design of what we do with the purpose. Every single project we do at every campus looks different because every campus is different. And so we can't design the same thing for each campus. But the second thing that you really need is inclusive planning. And you really need people at the table for two reasons. First, to include them in the design process, which is what I loved about what you said, to make sure that you're not unintentionally bringing any words into the room that will automatically let people know that they are not welcome. But the second thing is that it provides legitimacy to the process itself. So people actually buy into the process if someone they know is on the planning team and has bought in. And I know that that's happened at PC a tad when they've actually had some folks in the School of Theology or in the Department of Theology come into this, and they were pretty skeptical at first. And so there's a way to bring folks into that planning conversation. And to make sure that it's inclusive. So in one of our secondary schools, this actually just happened, but we've actually been working for the entirety of this year to train faculty, staff, and students to facilitate and engage more constructively in dialogue. And when the shooting in Parkland happened, the students organized a walkout. But then they worked alongside staff, administration, and faculty to set aside time, out of class time, the rest of that afternoon, to engage in a campus-wide dialogue and a campus-wide conversation about what a safe school looked like for them and how they were going to help build that together. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you have both student buy-in and administrative buy-in. And it creates these opportunities that you didn't have before, but it also can lead to people saying no when you need to say no. And one of the students, in one of the campuses that I work with a group of student fellows who are amazing facilitators. And it's been so fun to just partner with them in this. And their professor at one point asked them to engage in a dialogue for disengaged students. And they took a look and they kind of gathered amongst themselves and they did an inclusive planning process. And they started asking questions like, who are disengaged students? Are they the marginalized students, the students of color, the conservative students? Are they the engineering students? What's the outcome of this? What's the purpose? Are we making recommendations to an administration? Will they actually follow them if we do? Are we going to be tokens of the administration if we do this? Or are we just trying to build community on campus? And if so, are we allowing the right time to do that? And ultimately, they said no, or not until next fall. So they're going to start this up next fall when they can bring in some of those disengaged students, some of those administration, and have a conversation about how they can design this in a way that works for them and actually have time to implement whatever comes out of that. And so even though they didn't end up running a dialogue, I still saw it as an awesome success of these students taking a thoughtful look at what they can do and saying not yet.
Great. All right, so I'm hearing key elements to deliberation and dialogue is inclusive planning, purposeful planning and intentionality, which leads to these other ways of thinking, of checking our language, choosing who's in the room. Nick and Rhonda, do you have anything to add in terms of essential elements?
One thing I would add from what Bill and Katie are saying is I think the importance of the language that dialogue and deliberation folks use of naming and framing issues. So, when we're organizing a conversation on campus with different constituency, how is the issue named? And it will be named differently by different folks. So is it white supremacy? Is it anti-racism? Is it diversity? Is it creating a beloved community? Those are different ways to name an issue. So really thinking that through. And I think the most important lesson is to name it according to how ordinary folks who are part of the conversation would name it, and it would be meaningful to them, and not how outside experts name an issue. And then the second piece is framing it. So framing it in a way that you can have a diverse group of folks struggle with the trade-offs, struggle with, what does it mean to make this kind of decision? If we go this way and we make this decision, what are the negative consequences? And to struggle through a process like that together. So it's really important. And our campus, we've really struggled with, often the dialogue initiatives feel like they're top-down. They're coming from the administration as a response to a bias incident or organizing by students. So there's been a lot of pushback, mostly from activist students who feel, like Katie is saying, who just feel like this is what we need is action. We don't need more conversation. So that's a challenge, but I think if you really have an inclusive planning process and are thinking about how issues are named and framed, that's an important practice.
Great, thanks.
I'll quickly share something that, similarly to Bill, I have to say it because it's a do no harm principle. The first students who got involved in dialogue and sustained dialogue weren't trained specifically on race and ethnicity. They chose to dive in, but what they were significantly holding themselves to were deep principles of listening, caring about each other. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not enough for some facilitators we train or work with. You do need a deep well of knowledge about some of the key dynamics between groups. And I can see places where I facilitated when I was younger, where I just didn't understand key dynamics. Think, for example, about dynamics between environmental justice folks and agriculture advocates. It's a dynamic that's got a story and it's got a history. I can't honor it if I just walk in blindly and sort of walk into all the cliches of that conversation. I need to be familiar with the common opinions on all sides. I really do, and to do a good job. And this is where I see practitioners who want to jump into dialogue making some missteps early on that lose them credibility. So for instance, the classic example is you're holding a dialogue about race. And you get so excited that someone Black is sharing that you let them share to a point where people start to pick apart their story and sort of tear them apart, and they don't ever want to share again. But you don't recognize that this is a pretty common battle fatigue dynamic that happens to a lot of marginalized groups, so you just let it go as a facilitator. And you're like, yay, 100% class participation. That person hasn't shared yet. They shared. Did I do a good job? And that's a no, unfortunately, in dialogue. There's some big no's. And the reason I share it with this group is because I love the idea that we need to scale this work and everyone needs to be a part of it and just dive in. But at the same time, there is a principle of do no harm that has to be done. And I like that tension because it calls us to be better and to do better work. At the same time, I'm looking for partners around people who really want to get skilled and say, wait, there are some dynamics I can learn. It's not racist to learn about what may happen with a person who's a community activist in your group who identifies as a person of color. That's an important dynamic to prepare for in an all-white group, and that's something that I find people can be really optimistic about and sometimes underprepared around. And I'm sensitive to that, and I want to help in that area as much as I can, but knowing that it does take a deep well of experience around key issues. What have I seen over 20 years in dialogue of this? What can I expect to be cliche that's going to pop right up? Do I know that sometimes Jewish people think of Christians as kind of funny because they evangelize? Like, that's kind of funny. Like, those are key things that are pieces of content knowledge that sometimes are missing for facilitators, and that's worthy of study.
I also love that piece, and I love to listening in a way that you're willing to be changed. And I think that's a quintessential part of this. So many people, we actually have people call us all the time that are like, we're just going to start a dialogue. How hard can it be? Right? We're just going to bring people together for an hour. What could go wrong? Right? We're going to have 50-50 participation. It's going to be great. And it's not, generally speaking, but also because, I mean, usually the marginalized folks in the room are so used to having to tell their story to change minds that they're exhausted by it. They can't do that one more time, and it's unfair to ask them to. Or the conversation is structured in a way that the same person, those same two people, can still do 90% of the talking that you talked about earlier. So how do you structure the conversation in a way that allows for people to engage to a level that they're prepared to and not beyond? How do you create it and make it possible for people to speak and speak thoughtfully and speak in a way that slows down the conversation, because it's so easy for it to just spiral out of control and get back to those old debate dynamics. And so we've definitely seen that a lot, and there's definitely a tension there that I want to hold too, which is that, you know, there's on one side, it's the don't jump in unless you have something to ground you and some experience to ground you, but then there's also the deep need for this too. So it's just a give and take that's really tough.
Those are all great segues, because I wanted to talk a little bit about what are some things to consider and what are some of the challenges. So I've heard you need to consider that it's a structured conversation, that there are people that really have done deep content knowledge. They understand the context. I know Bill talked about checking your jargon and making sure that you're aware. So are there other considerations?
Well, in the design of Better Angels workshops, we decided from the beginning that people only needed modest facilitation skills. So some of it is what level you're aiming for. And so would 10 hours be enough as opposed to 6 months of training? So one of the ways to create safety, which I'm glad we brought up, because otherwise this is sort of a feel-good thing, you know, let's just go out and dialogue. One of the ways to do it is the more intensive training of facilitators. And another one is to give them a process, a container, and tell them they have to do it this way. And so the container, the process, protects the space. And that's what we found with the red-blue workshops. Mainly, the facilitators have to explain what's going on and enforce the ground rules the group has agreed on. And they don't freelance outside of that. And what we've learned is, and I have to say, having designed it and done and trained the original group, every time for the last 3 months I get another email that in North Carolina or in Massachusetts or somewhere, somebody with our modest level of training pulled it off. I go, yay, thank you. Because my big fear was that it was still too sophisticated. But it seems to be that people can hold the container and have good experiences for the groups.
Great. So defined rules and a defined process is our key.
Well, and what I'm really saying is design it for the level of competence that you're training people towards.
Right.
Another thing I'd say to consider, a couple of weeks ago, Beverly Tatum gave a talk, and she's doing a tour because it's the anniversary of her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? I know she was, I think, a board member at Campus Compact at one time. But what she said, which really stuck with me, is she said, if you don't talk about the problem, you can't solve the problem. But then she used this metaphor of antibiotics. And she said, it's like taking antibiotics where often we will start the antibiotics, but if you don't finish, the infection is going to come back worse. And we often start conversations, especially around difficult topics like race, but we don't figure out ways to finish those conversations and have a real rigorous process where people are going to come together. So I think an important component is to think about, you can't do a one-time 2-hour conversation about race and think that's going to solve the problem. So what are some of the processes you can build in so that you can do it in a way that's authentic and that allows for people to grow and to really build relationships and know each other's stories as a starting point, and then move towards a place where you can really start solving a problem.
Anything else?
I think just to add on to the hold the container piece, I love that metaphor, and we use it all the time for our facilitators. And sometimes our facilitators will have kind of a nitty-gritty 2-hour training or 4-hour training. But I think the other piece to keep in mind too is that for us, what we found is that if that container, there's some pieces of our model that can be transferred from project to project. There's some pieces that can't. So for instance, cultural relevance for that container, for that process, is so important. Some cultures really, how they feel heard is that no one interrupts them. And other spaces, you only feel heard if people are bouncing back and forth with you and everybody's engaged and there's that really rigorous kind of dynamic that you kind of jump in. Sometimes showing emotion can really stymie a conversation. But sometimes asking people not to show emotion, ask them not to participate. And sometimes equal time for everyone is great because it makes sure everyone gets the same amount of time to speak. Other times, if you have folks for whom the primary language of the dialogue is not theirs, or if they have any, sometimes even more introverts or people who have storytelling cultures, who when you ask them to keep their stories to 2 minutes, they're like, who are you? Get out. This is not us. Right? So how do you make that container relevant? And that goes back to that inclusive design stuff that we talked about earlier. But that container is so, so important. And you can, to a certain extent, drop facilitators into that container. But if they're dropped into a container in a way that isn't relevant for those cultural norms, then it's going to become problematic as well.
I wanted to quickly add, there's a tendency I notice we train a lot of faculty, staff, and people who really want to do dialogue, but they've sort of, after their years of experience in the classroom or in their work, they've sort of got like 2 good principles and they stick by those. So like, I let everybody speak equally, and like, yeah, I mean, when I know that it gets heated, I think we're doing really well. Or, they've got this like 2 inputs that they really think that they've done a good job when those inputs are in. The work of dialogue requires a lot of flexibility around what a group needs, as Katie's describing. So if you know that you're a person who sort of sticks to 2 mantras and you've got your signs of success and you apply them in all cases, well, I got the quietest person to speak up, so I did it. Or I really got them thinking. Those things can be a little dangerous in dialogue, those mini goals, because they don't actually measure outcomes, they just measure inputs. Okay, something happened. Okay, I check that in with that. We've all been a part of bad diversity workshops, right?
Oh, yes.
That's an input problem where, I saw people were crying as a part of the process, so things went well. Yeah. It's the same thing as sort of saying, well, I gave everybody a chance to speak once, so it was good, right? And those are input measurements. They're not outcome measurements. So checking in with a significant piece of our process that every time I get a call from a moderator or facilitator, I generally say the same thing. Are you debriefing at the end of your sessions? Are you asking people, all right, let's pause the conversation. How did we do on our ground rules? Where did you personally feel like you weren't able to share? What did I do that I could do better? And if you don't end your conversations with that, you'll never really be able to kind of hit the goals for that group. And it sets its own ability to get better over time rather than a leader sort of just saying, well, I've got an input, like, oh, do you see how the women spoke up? I'm doing great. You know, these are incomplete ways of measuring success, and each dialogue requires a serious degree of facilitator or moderator attention to the differences in differential impact of each action, which is exactly what Katie's saying.
So you saying that actually raises a question for me around assessment. How do you know that you've been effective? And what ways do you all measure that? I would imagine that that's a challenge. So I'd like to hear any thoughts about that.
Can I share? We measure our results against NSSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement. So we know that we're encountering some deep growth in terms of engagement. For instance, a semester of sustained dialogue participation with the same group over time seems to be about equivalent of a year to 4 years of college in terms of ability to kind of interact across lines of difference confidently and amount of contact between people who identify from different backgrounds. That's how we do our measurement, and it's a continual chore. We do think in terms of individual outcomes like critical reflective thinking. Can I think through the experience of others and not just how to change it, but how to change it in partnership with it? But because our work is based in peace building, we have to go a level further in terms of our figuring out whether we're successful or not. So we're the people who were trained involved in campus conflicts this year that dehumanized others. That's one measure of how we can think of, are we being impactful or not? Do they see this as a tool to do in the room, but not as a way to structure action that can actually lead to change? And that's somewhere where we can grow a lot on. It's really hard to get people to not just see, this is a thing I'm doing right now, instead thinking, I need to design a change process to work with the administration better. How do I do that in language that's gonna build relationships no matter who I see them to be or who my peers are pressuring me to see them to be? And that's a real challenge. And then, of course, we try to think in terms of campus climate, which is a big ask. But we do. We consider the goal of every program to create a culture of dialogue on campus. And we see some big gains there. So for instance, at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, they're a program that has implemented at least 7 different sustained dialogue initiatives on campus, and they continue to proliferate, which is good for us. When a bias incident or a controversial incident with fraternity members happened, the fraternity members sent out an email to the whole school. You know, we clearly have done something because we notice you're speaking angrily at us, and we're intending to listen deeply enough to be changed by what we learn to you, which is clearly language from our training, which we think is great. And if fraternity members really are sincerely taking that as a way to interact with a group that they've hurt, I think that's a significant step forward for a community being able to heal up from something. And that's something that we tend to see over time. It takes years for a campus to start to really practice listening together rather than deciding what someone else should do or should think, or this person needs to think this about trans issues. They're not where they need to be on these issues. That's not gonna work. We just need to listen and practice that intentionally for years first. So we have a multi-year change process, which nobody wants to hear, I recognize. But it is significant. Some of the administrators I work with, bless them, they're like, okay, this person really needs to make some gains on insert academic topic here. And I say, okay, well, do they trust you? Have you built relationships with them first? This is gonna take years for the campus to really respect the people right next to them. And that's what the goal is, really nothing less than that.
And so, Bill, I know that your events are shorter term. So how do you measure success? How do you assess?
Oh, I'm sorry I went after you. We're just at the very early stages, and we have a survey that we give people right afterwards. And but we have attracted the interest of some political scientists who study polarization. And when we get the resources, we want to do a randomized controlled trial and follow up. But I was just fascinated by what you were talking about. You're brave enough to say this is going to take years.
Yeah, nobody likes
And
it.
these are at American colleges and universities?
Yeah, nobody likes it. We're really unpopular with certain people.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to follow up on, I'm sorry I'm taking away here, is you're working against the tendency to say those people aren't enlightened enough on this topic, and our job is to get them enlightened, to get them woke. Right?
Yeah.
It's exactly that.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
No.
It should. Because
what-
there are
yeah.
degrees of enlightenment, and you and I have more than others, and my job is to get them to where I am, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work. One of the shorthands for it that we use is we think about groups A and B. Group A, wonderful people. You think about all the things that they might do damage around in a conversation with diverse constituents. They're going to use language that alienates them. They're going to they're going to do microaggressions galore. They're not when somebody says, "Hey, that's a microaggression," they're going to be like, "What's a microaggression?" That's group A. Wonderful people, and a lot of times their civic heart is exactly where it needs to be, and that's what I need. Then there's group B. They know all the words. They've learned all the words. They're woke. They're as woke as can be. But after a long time of dealing with group A, they've lost some skills around relating and humanizing that group A, and they don't want to deal with them. They're done with them. They've sort of written them off. They've decided they're incredible. They've decided they're naive, and that they are going to accomplish what they want to accomplish in the world without group A. But the problem is you take any topic, we're all in group A on something and group B on something else. So it doesn't work. It's a complete calamity. So we try to create these group C leaders is what we tell students, especially angry student activists. I need you to be group C. I need you to have relational skills. And I do want you to know some things, like there's some readings like that may be helpful for you if you're into that sort of thing. But really, I need you to care about the people next to you no matter who they are. And that's a lot to foment, and it really just takes them deciding that they want to be a bridge builder and a peacemaker, which is a bit of our evaluative intent. So,
Yeah, I think too for that piece, there's something that we evaluate. So when we evaluate our work, we also look over a longer period of time. And for us, we tend to judge, we base our evaluation based off of that community's or team's goals. So sometimes we are working campus-wide, and we are a small nonprofit, so sometimes we can or cannot look at campus climate data. More often, we're looking at little pockets. So what are their goals and what progress are they making? What's interesting about these pieces too is that we've actually learned not to necessarily rely too much on pre-surveys, because in pre-surveys, everyone's a great communicator. Yes. How are you at understanding others? I'm fantastic. And then how well do others understand you? They understand me terribly. And we actually see those, trends in almost every group that we work with, that more people feel they understand others before they get into a room and don't feel understood. And so we can bring that into the conversation over time. And what we measure when we measure impact is we measure 4 basic things. First, is there a greater level of understanding in that community? And understanding in terms of feeling understood, but also understanding those who are fundamentally different from you and respecting and honoring that they have something to give to this conversation. And then we look at healthy relationships and social cohesion. So are you a more cohesive group? And that's the piece that takes a while. We don't tend to see movement on that piece until at least 6 months after a project. We look at how committed people are to engaging across differences. Do they see value in it? Do they respect what people have to say? And also, are they engaging, right? How many conversations have they had that go well? How many conversations across difference? Do you have new relationships across difference? Have you improved maybe existing relationships across difference? So those folks in group B, have they been able to build those relationships? And then finally, are you making progress on what you wanted, on what you set out to do? Because our work isn't always sustained culture shift in a community, sometimes it is, but because it always isn't, sometimes it's like, we just need to get to this department meeting in one piece. Sometimes it's just accreditation. Sometimes it's just like, we just need this one thing. And so we can follow up and ask folks if they're making progress on that piece. And that requires and includes, are you using the skills that you learned? And are you working and engaging in groups more effectively? And so ours can be much broader, but it's also much more catered and kind of holds true to the change that we expect to see in every group that we work with, but also allows for a degree of flexibility around making sure that we're working with people's goals, because the work of dialogue, we don't want to assume that their goal is going to be the same as every other campus or every other community where we work.
Great. And Nick, I realize that you didn't get a chance to really talk about the two ways that you are doing dialogue at Providence. So I know you're doing faculty deliberative pedagogy within the classroom, but talk a little bit about the third space
yeah.
that you do and how you assess that.
Yeah, no, and let me add one story connected to this idea of assessment, and then I'll connect it to what we're doing at Providence College, especially this idea of it takes a long time, and how do we do this kind of assessment work? I always think of the story of the Highlander Folk School and Miles Horton. So the Highlander Folk School was an educational hub in the labor movement and the civil rights movement. And Miles Horton, I think, had this practice of dialogue. It was very much part of the ethos and continues today. But he talked about if, folks would criticize what they were doing at Highlander and say, all you're doing is sitting around telling stories. And he said, well, if you come to see me plant seeds in my garden early in the spring, you'd think I don't know anything about planting food. And I think that's the important piece, is a lot of the work that we're doing takes a while, and the kind of traditional notions of assessment don't fit within it. One of the things that we're trying to do at Providence College is we're trying to create what we call a third space. I mean, it's very much in the tradition of the Highlander Folk School and other spaces like that, where it's an off-campus site, and we call it the Providence College Smith Hill Annex, so it's the Annex for short. And it's a space off campus in the Smith Hill neighborhood, which is the contingent neighborhood to Providence College, where we've historically not had good relations. But it's a space that's not owned by the university, but it's also not owned in a traditional sense by the community. And it's a space that we're co-creating together. And we're trying to use it as a space for conversations, which are very relational, very much open, and very much can be co-created and developed by folks at the university, folks in the community, and together. And it's an important lesson from that is the importance of just having space for this kind of, like having the right kind of space is really a key ingredient for doing this kind of work.
Great. And how do you assess your outcomes?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the deliberative pedagogy book, the last section of the book, this was a book that came out of this Kettering project. The last section is all about assessment. And one of the things some of our colleagues put together was a grid around assessment, so the different stages that you might go through for dialogue and deliberation. Another chapter, which I think has been really important, was on Wake Forest University. And Wake Forest did a really intensive dialogue program, which was a 4-year developmental program. And now they've gone back and they've done longitudinal interviews with folks who are part of that. And that's another chapter in the book. So I think there's been some good work on assessment, but I think it's the hardest part of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a great segue. Also, you guys are good at that. So I know when you go to a panel, you're always wondering, well, what can I take? I need a tool. So if you all have any suggestions, I know you just talked about there's an evaluation element in what's the book again?
This is deliberative pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Do you have another tool that you would encourage folks to take a look at?
I guess a tool, I have two pieces. One is there's a Journal of Public Deliberation, which is an open source journal, which I think would be useful for folks. I will say one thing about the tool, and I think this is my closing thing, is around, the work we're doing on campus is too siloed. So the folks who I'm working with in community engagement, service learning are often different from the folks in dialogue and deliberation. And Martin Carcassonne just did he picked up a book on service learning, community engagement. And he did a post on Facebook about his experience with the book and looking at the book. And his post on Facebook, and I'm friends with him, I didn't get this from Cambridge Analytics, so don't worry. But what he said on Facebook was, he said, I just got this book on service learning, civic engagement. It was a big 41 chapters. There's no chapter on dialogue and deliberation. There's no mention of public deliberation in the index, nothing on public judgment, nothing on naming and framing. And he asked the final question, he's like, are we really this far apart? And it often feels like these are two ships sailing in the night with the dialogue deliberation work and the community engagement service learning work. And so I guess the tool that I would say, and is kind of a thing to take with us, is like to really think about how dialogue and deliberation can be a core ingredient of our reflective practice in service learning. And then at the same time, how we can use community engagement work and service learning work as a way to make the dialogue more than just talk. So I think to really think through on our practices how we can integrate these two practices.
Great, a tool or a resource.
Well, I will say as a shameless plug, the benefits of being a small nonprofit is that a lot of our work we provide for free on our website. So we have a full 140-page dialogue guide should you want to jump right in, but we also have a short 10-page way to do, or a guide on how to do dialogue across the red-blue divide that you can download for free on our website. We also do our whole monitoring and evaluation platform on our website for free and give it out. We also use longitudinal interviews, but it's a great way to keep in touch with folks that you work with. Finally, I have a couple of these with me if anyone wants one, but I brought some cards that we give out to folks on everyday agreements. And Bill mentioned this earlier, but it's kind of the agreements really help hold space for a conversation and hold that container. I would say if you decide to use agreements or ground rules in your conversation, it's a great takeaway, but just make sure that there are three things really. First, that they're observable and objective. So if you as a facilitator are intervening on ground rules, everyone knows that that ground rule has been broken. It's not, we're going to show respect, because respect looks different. It's, we're not going to interrupt, or we're going to speak for ourselves. Second, that it meets the needs of that group. So don't just take them off the internet. Actually ask people what they need for a good conversation. And then third, make sure that everyone in the group is okay with a facilitator holding you to agreements. And that gives you the authority and legitimacy to step in and intervene should you need to do that. So that's a little takeaway. I have some cards with some everyday agreements that we use, but if you use agreements in your own community, just keep those things in mind.
Great, thank you, Rhonda.
I'll give you my favorite tool from our workshop, and I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. The 4 C's is what we ask everyone to remember after a workshop. It's a way to disagree in dialogue in a way that continues the civic space and keeps you in relationship. So the first C, somebody says something that you perceive as controversial. The first C, clarify what they mean by it. Check in about whether you've heard it correctly, so a clarification or paraphrase. The second C to do in that case, you've heard something controversial, after you've clarified, you can only do this. Change the conversation from opinions to experiences. So what's important for me to know about why that's important to you? Somebody might say, I've been teaching 20 years and I've had nothing more important to me than this particular experience. So the second C, again, is to change the conversation from opinions to experiences, to get deeper into that ladder of inference of where somebody's coming from. Then the third, if you're facilitating something formal like a classroom or in a group of vistas or volunteers, create space for others to chime in, but not just chime in with their opinions, to chime in only after they've heard the experiences that have informed somebody else. So only after that second C can you do the third one, which is create space to react to what they've heard of another story. And then fourth, which can only be done fourth, if needed, challenge with a credible counterpoint about what somebody else, what millions of people might hear from what somebody's saying if the opinions are still resting really strong within the group, or if they've all come to consensus. So that's the 4 C's. You don't have to come to my session. We're going to practice that and ask people to talk about their political beliefs. And then like Katie, we have a lot of free stuff. If you go to our website and look under resources, you do a quick sign up on, like similar to how Essential Partners does, and then there's 25 dialogue guides on everything from, you name all these topics that nobody wants to talk about. Culture of sexual assault, whiteness and white privilege, ableism, all these things that are like sound really jargony, but it can be really helpful if you know you're going into a room. So there's 25 topics and we're continually producing those. And usually they're about 2 pages long, except for Israel, Palestine, and culture of sexual assault, which you might imagine are both 7 pages long. And we use a lot of the same tools from Essential Partners for talking about Israel, Palestine, what's at stake for you, and giving you some key questions so you don't ever have to feel unprepared for a conversation.
Yeah, we talk a lot.
Yeah.
With Better Angels, our training is free, and we expect people not to charge tuition when they do it. And within a couple of weeks, our moderated training is going to be online. Be about 15 hours worth. What we've learned is to scale this, we have to, give it away, and we have to put it online, and we ask people to hold to the container we've created. So go to Better Angels, and if you want to learn to be a moderator and join this community. And then this has been such a rich panel, so I'm going to give our little tip here. Because we deal with public policy. Okay? That's our thing, red, blue, public policy. And in every phase of our workshops, we ask people to assert something like, why is your side's values and policies good for the country? And then, what are your reservations or concerns about your own side? So we always pair the positive and what's good and workable about this with what's your self-critique of it. And that creates a kind of humility in the workshops where people see the other side are not just fanatics.
That's great.
So this has been really enlightening and really inspiring, and I commend you for the work that you're doing. Last night as I was lying in bed, I was thinking about the James Baldwin quote. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of things that you don't see. And I feel like dialogue is a way for us to build connections and trust that will then lead us to the kind of engagement that will create the change that our world needs. And so I'm grateful that we have people who are on the front lines doing that work, and I hope that everyone is inspired to also get involved and add this practice to the work that you're doing. So thank you, and have a great day. Thank you.